Hey friends, it's August, the end of August to be exact, which means that for those of us in the US, it is also coincidentally back to school time. Now, I am not in school, I'm not a teacher, and I don't have children in school. So you're probably like, Melody, why does back to school even impact you? Growing up in a school system, I have a lot of educators in my life and lots of people that work in school systems in my family. And I also now have friends with children in school. So I have been seeing a lot of back to school posts. And so it's just had me thinking about both the things from maybe more the elementary school age I miss about school reading culture, and also books that I read recently or recently within reason as an adult that I think are in really interesting conversation with their source material in terms of classics that you might read or study in school. And when I was in high school, a lot of our English classes were discussion based and kind of like Socratic seminar style. As someone who hasn't studied education and the methodology and whatnot, I can't speak to whether that is still the kind of most favored form in terms of English education, but something I really enjoyed when I was studying. So I thought for today, as a mental exercise, as always, we could both kind of live in the nostalgia of things we miss about reading life when we were kids and talk through some of these books that I think are great intertextual pairings for classics. So we see a decent amount, or at least I see a decent amount of nostalgia posts around reading culture in our childhood, especially related to book fairs and the Book It Pizza Hut program, for sure, which were of course loved. And I think there is a lot of really valid discourse going on right now regarding book fairs and the equitability of book fairs and when kids can't afford to participate in book fairs, all of that. But for now, I'm going to be talking about a lot of this strictly through a nostalgia lens. So when we're talking about kind of coming out of the summertime, back into the school year, I think of Accelerated Reader because Accelerated Reader was something that started over the summer, or at least continued over the summer and kind of bridged into the school year. So we had our summer reading program, and a lot of the titles I remember reading involved Accelerated Reader so that I could take the tests. And I don't remember how those points translated between summer reading program and school year, but I think that there was some cooperation between the local libraries and the school system. I don't know if Accelerated Reader is still a thing, and I'm sure there is a lot of critique and discourse around that as well. I will say my aunt, who is a retired kindergarten teacher, started leading the children's programs at the library I attended as a kid and managed to find a picture of me taking an Accelerated Reader test, probably I want to say based on the haircut around 5th grade. And maybe I'll throw that picture in here, or maybe I won't. I will say about the haircut, one, it was the early 2000s, so this was a thing. Two, my hair was cut off into like shoulder length or shorter when I was in 2nd grade so that I couldn't chew on it. And so by the time I gained the independence to make my own decisions about my hair, the only way to go was shorter. So I went into kind of like borderline bowl cut for a hot second, and then that spike cut became really popular, and my stylist talked me into it being great for my face shape, and then I spent years growing that out after I no longer wanted that. But I remember reading these Accelerated Reader books, and at the time it was a new program, so the difficulty was not all of the books I wanted to read were in the Accelerated Reader program. And there was also that little bit of gaming the system in that you could read books below your reading level to get more points or to kind of build up some points, but you couldn't read too many because you had to like kind of stay within your reading level too. You couldn't make it too obvious what you were doing, though I know that it was surely pretty obvious, and I forget completely what those points even went toward. What I do remember about summer reading and the end of summer reading is that we used to have like a big party in the park across the street, and we would have like ice cream sandwiches and like a celebration and surely like those icy popsicles, and we'd all get a book if we completed the summer reading challenge or whatnot. Maybe it was associated with Accelerated Reader. My memory is not great, but I remember we either got to pick a book, or one year I couldn't make it to the party. And so the librarians picked out a book especially for me. And at the time, I wasn't super happy with the book they gave me because it was an old book. It wasn't an old copy, but I was given a copy of Norton Jester's The Phantom Tollbooth. and it was wrapped. They wrapped all the books like in the library binding, and it was really nicely presented, and they were like, we thought of you. We specifically picked out this book for you. So I was very grateful and enthusiastic, but when I got home, I was like, this is an older book, and I was a little bummed. But then I read the book and I adored it. And I think of that so often, this idea that books can be so much more on their interior than they initially appear, especially that book, and the idea of the transportation of it, but also just the care of a book being picked out especially for you. And sure, maybe they didn't think about it as deeply as they presented it. I was a kid, who knows? But I remember that feeling really special. And that's definitely something I miss. I know that lots of libraries have adult reading programs now, and technically Chicago does. And again, I love my library system, so no shade, but that's one thing I do wish we had, is we can complete a summer reading like challenge and then we're entered into the possibility of winning library swag. But there's something I just really miss about the idea of getting a free book at the end of the summer, especially one picked out specifically for you. And then I also just miss the idea of self-selected reading time, this idea that there was a portion of every day of our school day, our work day, so to speak, that we got to sit and read. And I know that this can often be a challenging time for students and teachers in that kids have wiggles, and sometimes it's hard to actually get kids focused on self-selected reading depending on the age. I was lucky in that most of my teachers continued with some form of self-selected reading. Even in high school, in my senior English class, Fridays were reading days, and it was my favorite day, but I just loved that dedicated time. And sure, as an adult, I can dedicate my own time to reading, but I also had free time as a kid that I also spent reading. And I would love just an hour of my day at work for them to be like, just, take a moment, just decompress, you can go read your book, and we'll come back in a little bit. Along with that idea of self-selected reading though, when I was in elementary school, we had something called Stop, Drop, and Read. I want to say maybe during Banned Books Week. I don't remember the exact week. And I don't know if this was a national program. So please let me know if you also had Stop, Drop, and Read. But Stop, Drop, and Read was my favorite thing, which as a slightly anxious person, you wouldn't think it would be because it's like all surprise and unknown. But the whole idea of Stop, Drop, and Read is that you had to have your self-selected reading book with you at all times during that week, because at any time the principal could get over the intercom and say that it was time to stop, drop, and read. And I think it was like 15, 20 minutes, I don't know, but the idea was no matter where you were, what class you were in, anything, you had to stop at that moment and read. I remember being in the hallway. The Stop, Drop, and Read came on. We had to sit down in the hallway and read. And I believe this was in addition to any self-selected reading. And one of the reasons I loved this is because it could get you out of things, especially PE. I did not like PE in school in the 2000s, in that kind of cultural moment. Unless I knew it was like scooter day or parachute day or that 4th grade square dancing section that I guess everyone did, but I don't remember square dancing to save my life. Either way, I loved the idea of just being able to stop everything and just sit down and read at any given moment. And I wish that had carried into adulthood. Granted, I create my own kind of stop, drop, and read going about my daily life. But again, I'm not at work getting an email from my boss like, all right, everybody, let's just stop, drop, and read for a second. It's never gonna happen, obviously, why would it? But think about how cool it would be if it did. But all of that nostalgia aside, let's talk about some books that I think are in really interesting conversation with their source material or the material they're based on, no matter how loosely the book is based on or inspired by that source material. And if you're looking for books to pair with classics in lessons, if you're tired or not tired or want to branch out beyond like White Sargasso Sea or Grendel, I think that these are options that would speak to readers potentially where they are today and offer really interesting and deep intertextuality within vivid worlds that they have created for their own narratives. Additionally, I know that Macmillan is in the middle of a young adult series where they are commissioning, I assume, popular young adult authors to kind of reimagine classics, popular classics, through a more diverse lens. And so I'm very interested in that project, but admittedly, again, haven't picked any of those up yet. Based on the idea of the project and the authors I've seen associated with it, I can only assume that those books are going to offer really interesting and compelling opportunities to dig deeper into those works as well and provide and enrich the intertextuality there. So even if you are not going to study any of those books alongside their source material, I do think it would be a boon to have them in the classroom. I don't know why I said boon like that is a word that I use every day, because it's not, but we're gonna move along. And admittedly, not all of these classics are like staples, or at least to my knowledge, are staples in teaching or especially high school classrooms, but some of them are, and you might have breakout groups, or you might just want to read some updated classics and kind of enjoy that intertextuality. I will also say right off the bat, shamefully, none of these are going to be remixes or reimaginings of Shakespeare, because I somehow just haven't read deeply enough in that. I know that I think Jeanette Winterson has a whole series of kind of updated Shakespeare. I tried to read The Gap of Time when it came out and just wasn't able to get into it at that exact moment, but it is something I've been thinking about, that series. Additionally, I do own Mona Awad's All's Well, as well as a Folger's copy of All's Well That Ends Well, because that's one of the plays I admittedly haven't read. So I will get to those eventually. I'm properly shamed that I haven't gotten to those yet, because especially after Bunny, I'm really interested to see what she's going to do there, but I just haven't yet. But in terms of books that I have read, and starting with the most recent, let's look at the pairing of H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau with Silvia Moreno Garcia's The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. So I talked about this pretty in depth in a Feature Friday, and I think the intertextuality here is really stellar, and the way that this book is in conversation with the source material is really where it shines. In the original, we get the kind of standard outsider discovering this place or this thing, and we're seeing things through those eyes. And we see an island that he kind of washes up on where things are not quite right, and come to find out the scientist on this island has been breeding creatures with sentience. So it's a little bit horror, but also born of a specific moment, especially when Darwin's theories were really kind of cementing within the cultural consciousness. And in The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, we are starting on the island. And there's still an aspect of horror in the way that Dr. Moreau is kind of playing God in the creation of these beasts, as they're called in the original. But what I find really compelling about Moreno Garcia's work is that it really complicates the idea of these creatures being beasts, and it also enmeshes the story within a more vibrant and tense political landscape, because the original is kind of separated from everything. We're on this island cut off, remote from the wider world, because in many ways our narrator is the outside world coming in and judging what is happening. And here the outside world is the danger in a lot of ways, and kind of looking at it slightly flipped. And she does kind of change and interrogate things. She complicates Montgomery, who is a character that we get in the original, but there is a lot of depth that is added to those changes, and I think that there is a lot of really compelling, interesting conversation that could be had about what those changes do for the story, how it again is in conversation with the original, but also how those changes really elevate or alter the meaning for a current modern reading audience. And so while to my knowledge, and again, there are a couple of backlist titles I haven't read, this is Silvia Moreno Garcia's kind of most straightforward adaptation of sorts. She is one of the best, if not potentially, no, I'm not going to label anyone the best, but she's in my top for sure, of authors right now that are really able to take genres, tropes, what have you, and kind of work them and spin them, playing into what really works from those genres, the moments and tropes and expectations that create the atmosphere and elevate the story that she's trying to tell, but then also subverting those expectations and playing with those tropes in really compelling and specific and purposeful ways that really take things to the next level. My two favorites as of now are, of course, Mexican Gothic and also Gods of Jade and Shadow, which is playing on fairy tales, but this is a really wonderful addition to that canon of work, and I think based on the narrative choices in this book, it sets out to be in conversation with the original. A lot of the choices here are directly referential in a way structurally that feels very purposeful, in that things that might be set out to be big reveals or twists in other books aren't structurally set up to be that kind of biggest twist here, and not in a bad way by any means, because I think that there is a lot of weight put on the idea of a twist surprising someone, when sometimes I think that the way a twist is executed to be in conversation with either another work or a kind of genre or body of work or what have you, I think that can be just as interesting. So Silvia Moreno Garcia has proven she knows what she's doing with this. And even if The Island of Dr. Moreau isn't something that you traditionally teach or read in the classroom or even outside of the classroom, because my audience is not in school. So if you're wanting to revisit classics and kind of pair them up, I definitely think that this is one to go for, even if the title itself is sometimes a little bit more of a niche genre kind of gothic title. But Silvia Moreno Garcia does gothic so well, and this is a different shade of gothic. And again, her writing and atmosphere and tone are really able to shift with those different genre conventions, even if it's just a different shade of a genre she's previously explored, you can really tell the difference. And then a book, if you have been here for a second, you have heard me talk about multiple times since it came out last year, and that is Nevo's The Chosen and the Beautiful, to be paired with F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. This is a look or a reimagining of The Great Gatsby from Jordan Baker's point of view. And not only that, but in this version, Jordan Baker is a Vietnamese adoptee, and there is magic. And so we're seeing this world of glitz and glamour and excess from someone who's both on the inside and the outside of this world and experience. And the magic plays so expertly into this because of the kind of frivolity of it and the way it kind of heightens the showmanship of this world and the glitz, like I said, but also it kind of deals with the devil and the price of the soul, and it really gives a figurative embodiment to some of the themes that are being explored in the original. And it's also queer, so I love the way it explores Jordan's relationship with Daisy, Jordan's relationship with Nick, the kind of tension between Nick and Gatsby, and it packs the action of the original novel that we would expect while also building out Jordan's exterior world a little bit more, especially in terms of her history with Daisy and also her relationship with her culture. And while that sounds like it would add a lot of length to what is a very short book, this actually isn't long at all, but the ideas it's exploring are so compelling, and the language and visuals and world it creates is just so beautiful in an already glamorous and heightened kind of environment that I think it just really works. And I think it underlines explorations from the original text from new angles, and who can resist a little bit of magic and danger? And then we have a Beowulf. This is the new Maria Devana Headley translation, which I admittedly need to finish reading. I started the introduction, so it's not like I stopped in the midst of the actual poem. And I know that there are very beloved translations of this poem that exist, and I know that Grendel is a very beloved book to assign in conversation with this original text. But may I suggest, if you want to try something new, and I love Grendel, don't get me wrong, The Mere Wife, also by Maria Devana Headley, is excellent. It is a modernization of Beowulf that takes place in a suburb. And so in this iteration, the hall of sorts is like, I believe, an HOA kind of cluster. And our main point of view is really through Beowulf's mother, and she's kind of this quintessential cutthroat suburban socialite. And it also offers a complication of Grendel and Grendel's mother, like we get in Grendel, but in a much different way because we are in suburbia. But it really complicates our idea of heroes and who holds power while also just being filled with killer sentences and prose. So I think that there's multiple ways, if you're interested in kind of re-exploring Beowulf, that you can approach it. You can read one of the more popular traditional translations and compare it to this updated translation. You can compare the updated translation to the kind of reimagining, one of the older translations to the reimagining, or all of them, which was what I had originally set out to do and then fell by the wayside a little bit. To be fair, her translation of Beowulf came out at least a year, I want to say maybe 2, after The Mere Wife. But The Mere Wife was stunning. And then if we're talking about reimaginings that really breathe new life into the source material or approach it in really interesting new ways, I cannot talk about that without talking about Home Fire by Camilla Champsy as a reimagining of Antigone by Sophocles. And granted, Antigone was a college text for me, but the stakes of that play are so high, and the act that sets everything in motion feels so innocent. And it's hard to understand what risk Antigone was taking to bury her brother as a modern reader. Or at least it was for me. We can create those stakes when staging the play. We can, approach it conceptually. We can do all kinds of things. Kind of approaching the original weight of that is something you have to build out. And in Home Fire, you have a modernized version of this that raises the stakes by associating Yzma, our Antigone figure. Her brother gets caught up with extremists and he is involved in a terrorist attack. And so in this, the stakes are raised to meet a modern audience, and it's much more evident how Antigone's act that for me as a modern reader felt so personal in the play and is personal, but this helps emphasize how that very personal act can also be political. And I think it also deepens a lot of the relationships in a way that you can differently in prose. And so this is without a doubt one of my favorite reimaginings, reinterpretations, retellings in recent memory. Now, to speak to what I would argue is a favorite of the wider reading public in terms of retellings, reimaginings, what have you, let's talk Madeline Miller's Circe in combination with Homer's The Odyssey. I'm going Circe and the Odyssey over the Song of Achilles and the Iliad because from my experience, we read the Odyssey and we didn't really touch the Iliad. And again, here, I think the Penelopiad is an existing text that is often read in conversation with the Odyssey. But I think reading Circe in conversation with the Odyssey is an undeniable opportunity. One, because it is so popular, it has kind of transcended. So a lot more people are aware of it in the larger cultural consciousness, and it opens up wider opportunities for dialogue. It also means readers are more likely to pick it up. I love that the writing in this feels epic and feels poetic in a way where even the style is in conversation with the original, although in a much different way, obviously. And I personally love that it kind of builds out on the magical side. In the Odyssey, we're watching a man kind of persevere and win against the whims of the gods. Here we're also seeing someone set against the whims of the gods, even if they are from that world. But we're also expanding and complicating a figure that we don't get to see a whole lot of in the original text in comparison. And the power in building out that story and giving a story to this woman who is presented as a villain in many ways, while also looking more critically at the ways Odysseus acts as a villain as well. So if for some reason you haven't picked this one up, I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to make the difference in you making that call, but just something to think about. And then Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which is a personal favorite. Did I read it in school? Yes and no. I didn't read it for class, but I did read it when I was in school. So I didn't really have anyone to talk about it with. And we are not lacking for reimaginings, updates, whatever we want to call it, for Jane Eyre. There are a lot of books we could pull in for this and a lot of retellings and updates that I have enjoyed reading. But the one that I would personally pull in for this intertextual conversation is Re-Jane by Patricia Park. And this was her debut, and I don't think she's had one since. I check in every once in a while because I really enjoyed this book. This is an update of Jane that makes changes that may upset some people who are looking for a bread and butter kind of retelling and update, but that I think offer such great opportunities, as I've said, for conversation and intertextual exploration. I think it's saying really interesting things about the source material. It critiques the source material in some ways while also being a love letter to it in other ways, and especially to the character of Jane and what that character deserves. And in this modernized iteration, Jane is half Korean, living in Queens, and becomes a nanny for this family, this wealthy, well-to-do family that has an adopted Chinese daughter. I love the relationship especially set out between Jane and Devon, the girl that she is nannying, and the way that the experience she has with this family sets her on a path to kind of reestablish her own cultural roots and rediscover those and figure out who she is. And so while this book features a lot of the structure of Jane Eyre and similar plot beats of Jane Eyre, it's really about this young woman coming into her own and settling into who she is. And it doesn't hide Bertha in an attic. And it refers to Rochester as Ed, which I think says a lot about how they treat that relationship, which I say lovingly because my dad's name is Ed, but that dynamic is definitely articulated in a different way and teased out in a slightly different way. And here I think the deviations and the choices that Jane may make differently in Re-Jane versus Jane Eyre offer the opportunity to really talk out why that is. So there are many ways you can go with pairing Jane Eyre up for modern dialogue, and you can't really go wrong necessarily with any of them, but I just wanted to offer this book up as an option because I don't see it talked about as much as I would like, and I really remember enjoying it. And then speaking of there are so many options, let's just touch on Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. It would be impossible to count, at least for me, it would be impossible to count how many versions of Pride and Prejudice exist, how many iterations, reimaginings, retellings, because it is constant. And if nothing else, so many modern hate to love tropes really pull on Pride and Prejudice as its kind of source material. I'm not saying that as a bad thing, it's just the building blocks. That being said, when things are pitched as more straightforward retellings or reimaginings, I often have trouble with them. Often if they're more loosely inspired, I find them more successful. And maybe it's just because the beats are so familiar and there are so many options that it can be hard to stand out, even as I often love the experience in the moment. But there is one recent-ish retelling that has definitely stood out for me and is arguably my favorite Pride and Prejudice reimagining in terms of written reimagining, and that is Aisha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin. This is a modern day Muslim Pride and Prejudice, and it sets our heroine against a hero who is a lot more traditional and comes off to Aisha as very judgmental, even as he is just more reserved and devout. And so it offers a real depth to these characters that feel intrinsic to them. And Aisha and Khalid feel like their own people, even as you can kind of see the outline of Elizabeth and Darcy there, but they feel much more fully formed than some retellings can to me. And so as a reader, I really understand what is pushing each of them forward as characters, what their wants and desires are, while also still finding joy in seeing the moments that are referential to the original and kind of seeing how they're transposed, but also because they are such fully formed characters with their own wants and needs that make sense within their world, the stakes feel high. It doesn't feel like we're just going through the motions of Pride and Prejudice, even as we can see, like I said, where the beats have been transposed, but those moments make sense within the journey of these characters independently as well. And so we see the miscommunications and misunderstandings in a different way, but that makes sense in a modern context. And I undoubtedly fell in love with these characters, and for me, this is the best Pride and Prejudice retelling I've read that I can think of off the top of my head. And I'm sure there are others, and there are others that I've enjoyed and that I love, but when I think of modernization of Pride and Prejudice and how to do it successfully, I think this book really sets the bar. And then if you want to speak more directly to the current moment, take The Once and Future King by T.H. White and pair it up with Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. The follow-up Bloodmarked comes out this November, and not just as a birthday present to me, surprisingly enough. But the hype around this book is for a reason. This is just so stellar. And it's a great young adult fantasy with a main character who is complicated and flawed and hurting, but impossible not to root for. I love Bree so freaking much, but it is also a really deep intertextual exploration of heroes and legends and who gets to tell stories and create legends, who gets to be the heroes, different kinds of magical systems and traditions, because we have the kind of magical system that's born of the Arthurian legend vein in the kind of forefront, and then we have the idea of ancestral magic. And I think this is so genius because it does pull on the cultural consciousness of Arthurian legend, and there are moments in here that are directly referential to things like the Once and Future King. We have a challenge that is organized around a boar hunt, which was a very specific passage in the Once and Future King that has stuck out to me, I think because it was so unexpected when I was reading it when I was a teen. And so it's updating and reimagining these ideas within a propulsive modern fantasy setting, but it's also, like I said, in direct conversation with these texts, especially as Arthurian legend often feels very fixed within the cultural consciousness, but is born of oral tradition and has morphed and changed with time. And this book is definitely interrogating this idea of systems that have rooted themselves in a history that can often be false, and also how these narratives have often progressed to exclude, and it complicates that idea. So it takes this thing that has become a lot more fixed than it ever really was and challenges it and says it needs to grow and adapt and change, and it explores how these legends need to continue to update. And it does this, like I said, within the confines of a really propulsive, active fantasy story with characters like Brie, who I love and are so incredibly well drawn. You can feel the wants of all of these characters in their actions in every scene. When I talked about this before, granted, I probably wasn't as articulate, not that I'm being super articulate now, but all of the actions of the characters felt rooted in what they wanted or needed in those moments. So there are layers to the ingenuity of this, but I think the fact that it's such a fun, engaging, accessible read, it's propulsive, it moves. You don't want to put it down as a reader, or at least I didn't. And while I understand reading experiences are subjective, and that's my own personal experience, that was my own personal experience. So it's engaging and it moves and you want to read it. And then it offers all of these opportunities to really dig in deeper and explore how it's in conversation with all of the legend and source material before, and being able to kind of talk about how things shift and change with time. Because even the Once and Future King is a very modern iteration of the Arthurian legend, which admittedly, even when I read it in the 2000s, I don't think I had the full grasp of. So this is really just me giving you any excuse to read Legendborn as if you need it, but you should really take any excuse to read Legendborn because it's great and I love it, and the new one is coming out later this year. Okay, and then this one is a little bit of a stretch, but it was more of the mood I experienced when I read it, the kind of atmosphere laid out, and that is The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry, to be paired with Middlemarch by George Eliot, because they both kind of had this sprawling sense to them, even as The Essex Serpent had a little bit more centralized propulsion. And I do need to reread The Essex Serpent and have that in the hopefully immediate future, because I do want to watch the series and hopefully respond to that. If you are interested in me digging into and responding to that series, let me know. If you're not interested, also let me know. I think if I remember correctly, I read this originally on audio, but don't quote me on that. But I definitely do need to go back. And while admittedly Middlemarch doesn't have any potential mythical creatures looming on the periphery, there is something about the way Perry draws the place and the characters here. She really cuts to the bone of humanity and presents really full, vivid characters. And Middlemarch also presents really full, vivid characters, which is part of why it's so long. Also, maybe I need to reread Middlemarch. I just remember feeling very strongly about my love for Mary Garth. So this one isn't as much intertextuality as if you're looking for something that lives within that tonal world, maybe something that's a little bit more accessible for modern readers, even if the syntax here isn't full modern. It does kind of root itself in that 19th century novel kind of feeling, which I think is how it's evoking a lot of that, but it also does still have modern sensibilities to it. So yeah, I need to reread this book. Again, let me know if you're interested in more on The Essex Serpent. And then to finish us up, because I don't know what the final form is going to be, but I have been here for a second, looking at Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll and Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, which are admittedly not my favorites. These are beloved works of children's fiction. They are part of the cultural consciousness in undeniable ways, though I would argue more so for the Disney versions, but their original texts aren't my favorite, but I have read them because of their cultural weight. That being said, because they're not my favorite, I am not really drawn to more traditional retellings of those books. Have I still read retellings? Of course. I've read Tiger Lily by Jodi Lynn Anderson. I've read Heartless by Marissa Meyer. I'm sure I've read others. But when I think of these works and being in conversation with these works, I think of Peter and Alice by John Logan. And this play takes one historical moment, the woman who inspired Alice in Wonderland meeting the man who inspired Peter Pan at an exhibition, and spins out an entire memory play from it, and it is just fantastic. It uses theatrical storytelling and the opportunities presented by theatrical storytelling and the theater to make the most impactful choices within the narrative, to my reading. I cried reading this play, and it's a little bit memory play because we're moving in and out of the history of these two individuals and how the course of their lives were shaped and changed by being the inspiration for these beloved stories. So it's a little bit memory play, moving in and out that way. But then we're also moving through the fantasy worlds of Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, and it's used to kind of juxtapose the emotional turbulence of these characters' current realities. It is just gorgeous, and because it is a play, it reads very quickly, The stage directions are written here almost poetically, and they're a masterclass in not being too prescriptive. They're not prose, they're not setting the entire scene, but they also provide real insight into the emotional interior of these characters and this world. And there is one bit of dialogue and stage direction at the climax of this that is a gut punch to me every time, and sometimes I will go back and read just that one little piece. I would love to work on this show as a dramaturg, and definitely when it came out, it was high on my wish list. It's just a really beautiful piece of theater that is in really active conversation with both the source material and the histories of these people, and it's staged and imagined in such an interesting, evocative way, and I think offers wonderful opportunities to really dig into what it's saying. So a little bit more winding today, but if you have recommendations for pairings of classics and updates, books that you felt really illuminated the original text and was in conversation in really engaging, exciting ways, please share those below, because gosh knows my TBR isn't long enough. But regardless, thanks for hanging out. Read something good, like and subscribe if you feel like it, and yeah, bye.